You're on.
Perfect. Good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Parker. This is Kristen Ishihara with the Ishihara and Parker Law Firm here in Longview, Texas. And today we have a fun topic that we see a lot of confusion about. People come see you, Kristen, and they say, hey, I need my loved one to go to skilled nursing, independent living, assisted living, the nursing home,
Sure.
all these different names. What are they really trying to say? What are they talking about?
You can't say for sure, of course, but often a loved one's had a health crisis and is at the hospital and then is not going to be able to go home. So the family is working with the case manager there at the hospital to talk about what are the care options. And sometimes that's, coming off of a health scare and going somewhere. Sometimes that's coming from home with just an escalating level of care need. A lot of times that's discovered at the holidays when kids come in to visit with their parents. So there's a lot of confusion about the different levels of care. A lot of times people will come in and say, well, we need memory care, or we need a nursing home, or we need this. So just understanding what the different levels are, which is going to be based on the facility and not necessarily our definition, but I think it helps in thinking about what the options are and then how to pay for them, because that's, at the end of the day, something you have to figure out too. So we're just going to give kind of an overall idea of what those things are. And so let's say that your parent...
Well, let me stop you real quick. So make sure I understand. You normally see it, there's a triggering event, right? Like you said, we have kids go home for the holidays and realize that mom and dad or mom, whatever it is, can't stay in the current situation. That's the first one. Either it's brought in by the client themselves or by their children. That's sort of like home-based issues that are being raised. The other one, which we see a bunch of, is there's a medical event. They go to a medical provider, and then at that point, the medical providers are involved, and that's the social workers that are at those facilities start saying, hey, listen, it's time to start transitioning to greater care than what they're receiving before.
Sure.
Right? So those are our two main tracks, at home, through the family, or usually involving a third party. But once that happens, then we start getting all these different options, right?
Sure, sure. And the base would be just living independently, and that would be considered, living at your home independently, or even living at an independent portion of a facility. So it could be a senior living, could be a graduated continuing care kind of community that has independent options, but might offer some group services. So the first level would be independent, but thinking about what kind of services you could take advantage of. So that might be caregivers in the home. That might be just arranging, a lot of times kids will help arrange meals with meal deliveries, grocery deliveries, transportation to visits, but just investigating what sort of support services might be there if you are going to live independently for a period of time. But when we talk about that, Chris, how are we paying for that one typically?
Yeah, I mean, typically when it comes to independent living, you're typically paying out of pocket. It's going to be private pay. I always kind of think of it sort of like, when you were in college, you went to your dorm rooms. Sometimes that's sort of the same thing. You're there. There's some people involved, but mostly your loved one's independent. And in the extra care is something you're going to set up on your own, just planning ahead. But they're very popular option. I mean, I've had a bunch of folks just say, hey, I lost my spouse. I don't want the house. I'm ready to transition to an easier setup. And I've had plenty of people just do independence, sort of like college for older folks, like a dorm room. So a dorm setting. So that's actually a very popular option, even if someone doesn't need more care. That's usually the most popular. But I also think we're pretty limited on help.
Sure. Yeah, there's not a lot of resources available there. There are some benefits if you are having financial difficulties, but those would be not healthcare related, really more just related to your income. So maybe subsidized housing or Meals on Wheels or food stamps. Those might be available, but wouldn't really be related to your age, would just be related to your financial situation. So if let's say mom were at home and I visited for the holidays and saw, oh gosh, mom's not really managing her medicine well. She might need a little bit of help preparing meals and making sure there's things in the fridge. My best choice might be just to engage a private caregiver that would go over 2 hours a day, that would help make sure those things are happening, but that's going to be privately paid for. That's really not going to be a service available through Medicare or other places. We'll mention the VA here when we get to assisted living, so there might be some benefits that might be available if you're a wartime veteran or surviving spouse. But for the most part, you would just plan to privately pay for that kind of care.
Yep. Obviously wonderful, obviously great. People love it and it extends their time in the home, but can be expensive.
Sure. All right, next on the list.
So if we're not going to be doing independent living, we might be considering doing assisted living. Assisted living is a wonderful option as well. Obviously, the level of care will be greater. There'll be more involvement, more people checking in, more of a daily schedule. But when people say, hey, I need to go to a facility, this is where you start seeing forks in the road, right?
Yep.
There are some places that are independent or assisted living only.
Right.
And there's some places that are skilled nursing only, which we'll get to in a minute. So people say, I want to go to this facility. Well, maybe. The level of care of your loved one kind of determines where they're going to go. So if something happens to my loved one and we're at the hospital and maybe we're thinking, maybe independent's not right. We need a little more medical setting, a little more people checking in. What is an assisted living? How do we find one?
Sure.
What does it mean?
Well, I think to your point, Chris, the most important thing, or one of the very important factors to consider there is if we do have that health crisis, we're at the hospital and we're discharging, are we going to be able to go home after a short stay in rehab with, maybe some resources at home, or are we going to be needing to stay long term? And then you need to know the financial situation because you are going to make a choice there. Typically, when we say assisted living or memory care, those are going to be private pay options only for the most part. Medicaid, which would be a option, the only governmental program that helps pay for long-term care, that would be an option only if you are at a skilled nursing facility that accepts Medicaid. So a lot of times people have a bit of a bias there and say, oh, well, we don't want mom to go to a nursing home. We want her to go to memory care or assisted living. You are making a financial choice there, and you need to realize that that's the distinction. So there's a little bit of a difference in level of care, but I think for just the practical reality that most people need to be understanding at that point is Medicaid available at that facility, and is that the path we need for my loved one? Because assisted living is going to be $5,000 or more based on your level of care. So let's say assisted living is a great option for you. That's wonderful. There's going to be varying levels of care. So you'll need to assess finances and make sure that that's something you can pay for. I would say at a base, you're probably looking at about $5,000, at least in East Texas. That could be different other places.
Yeah, and I think you want to have a real conversation with the business manager of the business. Say, hey, listen, I know we're starting at X. Give me an idea of what the graduated plan is. Because, transitions are always hard, and it's great to leave them if you can, the same facility, especially ones that are super nice. It's just you won't have an idea of what you're getting into. Maybe it is only $3,500 for this. But when you add this, now it's $5,000. But if you need this, then it's $6,500. Need this, it's $8,000. You just kind of have to have mentally in your mind, see what's coming, right?
Sure.
There's a progression, and that's just best to look ahead.
Yes, absolutely. So how do we pay for that one? Well, typically it's going to be private pay. As I just mentioned, if you are a wartime veteran or surviving spouse of a wartime veteran, VA aid and attendance might be available based on your resources and income to help kick in a little bit for that. And there is a very limited Medicaid Star Plus waiver program that has a wait list in Texas, so it's not available immediately. And there are limited assisted livings that accept that. In East Texas here, we only have one facility that I'm aware of that accepts it, so it's not a common option, but it is something to consider if your loved one needs assisted living, that Medicaid Star Plus waiver program might be available, might be worth putting them on the wait list for. But again, considering the financial picture, you need to make some decisions about care and making sure that that's something that can be financially sustained.
That's right. So we went from independent setting, either at home or perhaps with sitters, independent setting at a facility sort of place, but still independent. We have assisted living where we know we're receiving more care, the level of which isn't yet determined because we don't know what we're facing. We know, generally speaking, it's going to be private pay. Not always true, but for most people, most of the time, that would be a private pay situation. And then, of course, sometimes reach the level of care where we're the independent and assisted, it's not going to work. Right. We could have had a progressive disease that's gotten worse. That's common. It's no longer safe for our loved one to live alone. We could have had an accident that progressed, an unexpected event, and we're faced with a situation where actually our loved one isn't coming home. There's a good chance they're not going to get better. It's just they need to be cared for until the day they pass away, and they need to be done in a medical setting, right? That's a serious conversation that the medical providers will have with you, the caseworker, and sometimes even us. We can't tell you what to do, but obviously we see a lot of these situations play out, and you just be mentally prepared for it. It is a progression. So if we start looking at folks who need more care, it's not a situation we're going to get better, Kristen. What are the families looking at doing? How do we do
Yeah,
this?
and typically once you're at that level of care and you're saying that you need 24-hour care or daily medical care, essentially, I would say you're at the level of what we would call both memory care and skilled nursing care. And those two terms are thrown around with caregivers and hospitals. Typically, though, at least from the financial perspective, when you use the term memory care, you're meaning a private pay facility. So often an assisted living will have a memory care option there, and that just means assisted living that you're paying a greater level of care for, essentially. Skilled nursing is going to be a facility typically that has a rehab division that could be discharged to from the hospital, but then also has a long-term custodial option, and that typically you'd have to check with the facility, but often will allow Medicaid benefits to be applied for and received at the facility. And of course, as you're talking and looking at this for an individual, this is a conversation you are having with the facility. Our component of that conversation is not to tell you what level of care you need, but to help give you just some tools, because a lot of times people have investigated 5 facilities and they think each of them would be great for mom, but then realize on the back end that Medicaid's not available because they were all assisted living facilities, and we just want you to avoid that problem. If mom will need Medicaid to be able to stay, you need to know what sort of facility you're looking for, and it's going to be a skilled nursing facility that accepts Medicaid, and so there's a list of those that you can find.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, this is nothing you don't want to do, but if your parents or loved ones are getting older, and if you have any signs of issues that you know might be coming, I have plenty of folks who have strong bodies, but their minds are afflicted in bad ways. It would behoove you, if you're the children of this loved one, to investigate early. I mean, we have a lot of facilities in town. So people come in and ask and say, well, hey, what are my choices? I'm like,
We have some great options.
yeah. I was like, well, what have we got? I mean, I can think of a dozen without doing too much work, all within, 10 minutes of Longview. So there's lots of facilities, but they're all different. And I had some people click with one and not with the other. And the last thing you really have time to do when it comes to a time-sensitive emergency, because when your loved one's in the hospital now being discharged, there's a lot of pressure situations going on. You really kind of want to meet your facility in advance, kind of an idea what works for you and your family. They're all different. They all have different options, and some have their strengths and weaknesses. It's worth a visit to a couple of them in advance, because that way it'll take one piece of panic. And I've had people before say, hey, I have a great relationship with this place. I want to go to it, but it's full. Right. And, and suddenly their plans blow up. So I hate to say it, but this is one of the ones that if you're the adult children, if you want to avoid some of that pressure squeeze, you might really want to do a little advanced research.
Sure. Real good conversation to have as a parent too is thinking about, when can I make this decision myself? Because downsizing and moving to independent or a continuing care community is a bit of a gift that you can give a child, where you've made the decision, you've put in place how your care will be taken care of, and I think that can be really helpful to a child, especially if you don't have any kids in town. But once you are at the point of needing 24-hour care, it is definitely a serious conversation about finances as well. If that individual were to stay home and need 24-hour care, that bill's easily $15,000 to $20,000 a month. So that's just not going to be available for most people. If you need memory care, that's probably around $7,500 a month would be my guess. Can't be anywhere in that range. Again, these are things you would talk to the facility about. This is just to give you a start. And then skilled nursing would be, if you can be eligible for Medicaid, then Medicaid pays the bill in addition to your copayment. So it would be limited to your income. So it is something that would be affordable care for anyone that has that level need and meets all the other criteria of Medicaid, which we've talked about in other videos and won't do in depth here. But just to give you those different options and how those levels of care play into the finances for an individual, I think is important to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. I just think these are things you got to get ahead of. Most folks want to avoid this conversation with their parents. I understand. That doesn't mean you as an adult child can't do a little research on your own. Have a list of a top 3 facilities, like, hey, if disaster strikes, I've been to these places. I met them. I like them. They'd work fine. Maybe we don't want them, but if we needed them, it's nice to have an option, because the social workers, the hospitals will attempt to place your loved one where you want them if they have space, if it works, and if you're informed. But if it's a disaster situation and someone's going to recovery and going to their rehab days, they're going to do whoever's open, and that may not be what you want.
Right. There are some other limiting factors with placement. I just want to throw out there. One is behavioral. So if you have an individual that's got some behavioral issues, that is going to make placement a little harder. Nursing facilities or facilities in general don't, it's just like an apartment complex or other place. They are not required to take an individual.
Yep.
It's a two-way street there. So some placement things that arise are if that person has behavioral issues or is difficult in some way. And
Taking in and keeping.
sure.
I've had situations where people have been uninvited, and that can be a difficult situation as well. There's some rights and things go back and forth, but ultimately, in the day, this can be, if you have someone loved one with behavioral issues, you should doubly start your research in advance.
Right. And a lot of times folks are under the impression if they have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's or dementia that they're looking for a locked unit. At least here in Longview, there are not a lot of facilities with a specific locked hall. So I typically try and educate them that each facility will have a security measure. The front door is always going to be locked. And so that's not something that it depends on the individual, but that you certainly would maybe not want to limit your scope to just those facilities. Each facility will have a security measure in place, and you can determine that with the facility based on your loved ones and their tendencies. But
they'll tell you like, hey, the whole building has a lock. This hall has a lock. There's different levels of security, but all are, in my opinion, secure.
Right.
I mean, there's not just people wandering around. They're all secure. It's just what does that word mean, and what exactly do you need? Obviously some clients wonder a lot, and others do it once a month. That's just different. That's a different level of care concerns.
yeah, and like Chris mentioned, we have some great facilities here in Longview and in East Texas. We have happy clients and happy families at each of them. So we just encourage you to look and find the right fit. We just want you to have the financial piece kind of in mind as you're doing it, so your search is a little more targeted for what you're going to need.
Realistic.
Yes.
I've had many people fall in love with facilities, but then it's just not something that's going to work out financially, and they got to start from scratch again, and that's just a huge blow to the process where there already is so much stress. And if there's multiple people in charge, if you got a bunch of kids and everyone thinks they're the one in charge, it can get complicated.
Different problem, different video.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks for joining us. We will see you next time.
Well, it was awesome. Bruce should fix that. Did you